Some secrets are buried so deep that even time forgets them. But time has a way of unraveling the past when you least expect it. It started with a message. A simple, chilling sentence that shattered the illusion of safety. I know what you did. 5 strangers. 5 deadly secrets. And one anonymous message that threatens to expose them all. When the past refuses to stay buried, how far will they go to keep the truth hidden? Part 1. The message that changed everything. Edward's hands trembled as he stared at his phone. The message had no sender, no number, just a single line that made his heart stop. I know what you did. His breath hitched and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His apartment, dimly lit by the flickering city lights outside, suddenly felt suffocating. He had buried the past so deep, erased every trace. No one could know. So how? He swallowed hard, reading the words over and over. His mind raced through possibilities. Who could have sent this? Was it a sick joke? An old acquaintance resurfacing? Or worse, had someone been watching him all along? Outside, the rain drizzled against the window, creating eerie patterns on the glass. The steady hum of the city had never felt so distant. He checked the time. 11:47 p.m. Too late for prank messages. Whoever sent this knew exactly what they were doing. His phone buzzed again. You can't run from the past, Edward. Midnight. The old train station. Alone. A chill ran down his spine. He had spent years making sure no one knew the truth. He had been careful. Every loose end tied, every witness silenced by time and distance. But someone knew. And now they wanted to meet. He exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of his desk. There were only 2 options. Ignore the message and risk the unknown consequences, or go and face whoever had reached into his past and dragged it into the present. A soft chime from his laptop startled him. He turned, eyes widening. His email had just received a new message. The subject line was empty. With hesitant fingers he clicked it open. You don't have the luxury of ignoring me. Attached was a single image. His breath caught in his throat. It was a picture of him. But not just any picture. It was from that night. The one he had erased from existence. His pulse thundered in his ears. This was impossible. No one had been there. No one had seen. And yet the image was proof someone had. His world had just cracked open. And whoever had sent this message was waiting in the darkness, ready to pull him into the abyss. Edward couldn't tear his eyes away from the image. The dim glow of his screen cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the cold sweat beading on his forehead. His hands trembled as he hovered over the mouse, debating his next move. Every instinct screamed at him to delete the email, to pretend it had never arrived. But the rational part of his mind knew that wasn't an option. Whoever had sent this had proof. And proof meant power. His phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, his heart pounded so violently he thought it might break his ribs. Tick-tock, Edward. You're running out of time. Midnight. The old train station. His stomach twisted into knots. He hadn't set foot in that place in years. Not since that night. His thoughts reeled back to the past, to memories he had fought so hard to bury. The smell of rust and damp earth, the distant wail of a passing train, the way the moonlight had cast long eerie shadows that night. And then, a knock on the door made him jump. Edward spun toward it, his breath shallow. He wasn't expecting anyone. Not at this hour. Cautiously he stepped forward, every muscle in his body tensed. He peered through the peephole, but the hallway outside his apartment was empty. No sign of movement. Then, just as he was about to turn away, bang. The sudden, sharp knock made his pulse skyrocket. This time, when he looked through the peephole again, a small white envelope lay on the floor outside his door. Swallowing hard, he unlatched the door and reached for the envelope with shaky fingers. There was no return address, no markings of any kind, except for his name scrawled in neat, bold letters across the front. With a deep breath, he ripped it open. Inside was a single slip of paper. Midnight. The train station. Don't be late. His vision blurred for a moment as adrenaline surged through him. He staggered back into the apartment, the walls closing in on him. His mind was screaming at him to run, to leave the city, to disappear before whoever this was could tighten the noose around his neck. But he knew better. You can't run from the past. Not when someone is determined to bring it back to haunt you. The minutes crawled by as Edward sat in his apartment, watching the clock tick closer to midnight. His fingers drummed anxiously against the table. His gut told him this was a trap. And yet he couldn't ignore it. By 11:30 he had made his decision. He grabbed his coat, his keys and a small pocket knife just in case. He wasn't going down without a fight. The city streets were empty as he made his way to the train station. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the scent of wet asphalt and the occasional drip of water from rooftops. Each footstep echoed in the night, amplifying his sense of unease. The train station loomed ahead, abandoned and forgotten. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the rusting tracks stretched into darkness. A single flickering street lamp cast weak pools of light, barely cutting through the thick fog rolling in from the river. Edward swallowed hard as he stepped onto the platform. His breath hung in the air, misting in the cold night. His phone buzzed one last time. "I see you." His pulse thundered. He wasn't alone. And whoever had brought him here was already watching. Part 2, The Shadows Know Your Secrets. Edward's heart pounded like a war drum as he stood on the decaying platform of the abandoned train station. The air smelled of rust and damp wood, thick with an eerie silence that pressed down on him like an unseen force. He clutched his phone tightly, staring at the last message. "I see you." His instincts screamed for him to run. His body tensed, muscles coiled like springs. But running wasn't an option, not yet. He needed to know who was behind this. Needed to know how much they really knew. A gust of wind rustled the brittle leaves scattered across the tracks. Then, movement. A flicker of shadow from the far end of the platform. His breath hitched. Someone was there. "Who's there?" Edward called, his voice steadier than he felt. Silence. Then a low, distorted chuckle. Edward swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the small pocket knife in his coat. The dim light of a distant street lamp barely illuminated the figure standing at the edge of the platform. A hooded figure. Motionless. Watching. Edward forced himself to take a step forward. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, considering him. Then, in a voice so low it barely reached over the wind, it said, "You already know." A shiver ran through Edward's body. "No, I don't," he lied. The figure let out another soft chuckle. "Lies, Edward. That's all you've ever known, isn't it?" Edward's stomach twisted. "I don't know who you are, but if you think you can scare me—" "Oh, I don't need to scare you." The figure took a slow step closer. "I just need to remind you." Edward's grip on the knife tightened. "Remind me of what?" The figure reached into their pocket. Edward tensed, prepared to fight, but instead of a weapon, they pulled out a folded piece of paper and dropped it onto the platform between them. Edward hesitated before stooping down to pick it up. He unfolded it with trembling fingers, and froze. A photograph. A photograph from that night. The night he had spent years trying to erase. The dark alley. The blood. The fear in that man's eyes before everything went black. Edward had made sure there were no witnesses, no security cameras, no loose ends. And yet here it was. Proof. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. The figure took another step forward. "You always thought you covered your tracks. But someone was always watching." Edward's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't possible. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure let the silence stretch before answering. "Someone who knows what you did, Edward. Someone who knows what all of you did." "All of you?" Confusion flickered across Edward's face. "What do you mean?" Before he could finish, the figure took a step back into the shadows. "Tick-tock, Edward. The past doesn't stay buried forever." Then, before Edward could move, before he could react, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. Edward stood frozen, the photograph burning against his palm. His secrets weren't just coming back to haunt him. They were coming for all of them. Part 3, The Past Never Sleeps. Edward clutched the photograph so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The station was empty now, save for the howling wind sweeping through the crumbling platform. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but one thought dominated them all. He wasn't the only one in danger. Who were the others? The figure's words echoed in his head. "Someone who knows what all of you did." Edward's past was a carefully constructed web of lies, each thread woven together with precision. But now someone had found the loose strands. Someone had begun to unravel everything. He needed to act fast. The first person that came to mind was Rebecca. They hadn't spoken in years, not since they had all made the unspoken pact to bury the truth. But if someone was after all of them, she had to be warned. He pulled out his phone, fingers shaking as he dialed her number. It rang, and rang, and rang. Voicemail. A pit formed in his stomach. He didn't leave a message. Instead he texted, "Call me. No. It's urgent." No reply. A flicker of unease settled in his chest. Had they already gotten to her? Edward needed to know. He grabbed his coat and rushed out into the night. The drive to Rebecca's apartment was a blur. The city lights stretched into hazy streaks as he sped through the near-empty streets. His mind whirred with every possible scenario, none of them good. By the time he reached her building, the unease had evolved into full-blown dread. The front door was ajar. Edward's pulse spiked as he pushed it open and stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering above him. He took the stairs 2 at a time, reaching Rebecca's floor in seconds. Her door was slightly open. A cold sweat broke across his back. "Rebecca?" he called out, stepping inside cautiously. Silence. Then, a noise from the bedroom. A rustling, almost imperceptible. Edward's grip tightened on his pocket knife. He edged forward, every nerve in his body on high alert. The hallway stretched before him like a tunnel, the open bedroom door looming at the end. A shadow moved. Edward froze. Something wasn't right. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the room, and immediately stopped cold. Rebecca was there. But she wasn't alone. Her body lay sprawled across the bed, unmoving. And next to her, scrawled across the wall in thick, dark letters, "I warned you, Edward." His breath came in ragged gasps. He rushed to Rebecca, pressing 2 fingers to her throat. A pulse. Faint but there. Relief flooded him, quickly replaced by panic. She was unconscious but alive. Someone had left her like this, left a message for him. He grabbed his phone, dialing emergency services with one hand while gripping his knife with the other. As he spoke to the dispatcher, something caught his eye, a small, white envelope resting on the nightstand. Hands trembling, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was another photograph. This time it wasn't just Edward. It was all of them. Edward, Rebecca, Ryan, John, and Alina, standing together on that fateful night years ago. The night that had come back to haunt them. Written across the bottom in sharp, deliberate strokes. 1 down. 4 to go. Edward's blood ran cold. The past wasn't just catching up to them. It was hunting them down one by one. Edward's mind raced as he crouched beside Rebecca's bed. He tried shaking her gently, whispering her name, but she remained unresponsive. The sight of her pale face, her stillness, it sent a fresh wave of terror through him. He checked her breathing. Shallow. Whoever had done this hadn't wanted her dead. Not yet. They wanted her to suffer. He gritted his teeth. The sound of approaching sirens filled the night, growing louder. Edward knew he couldn't be there when the paramedics arrived. He had too many questions to answer, and right now he needed to find Ryan, John, and Alina. Edward reached into Rebecca's bedside drawer, his fingers closing around an object he recognized instantly, her old keychain. Attached to it was a small USB drive. His pulse quickened. Could this be what the figure was after? He pocketed the drive just as flashing blue lights filled the apartment. With one last look at Rebecca, he slipped out through the fire escape, disappearing into the shadows. Part 4. Shadows of the Past. Edward's heart pounded as he slipped into the alleyway behind Rebecca's apartment. The sirens were deafening now, flashing blue and red lights cutting through the darkness like a warning. He pulled up his hood and kept his head down, forcing himself to breathe. He had to keep moving. The small USB drive in his pocket felt like it was burning against his skin. He needed to know what was on it. He needed to know why someone was coming after them, one by one. Edward found an internet cafe on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions. He paid in cash and sat in a dimly lit corner, plugging the USB drive into an ancient computer that hummed as it powered up. A single folder popped up on the screen. Confidential. His throat tightened. He clicked on it. Inside were several video files and a document labeled Final Night. His hands trembled as he opened the first video. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage of a dark forest. A group of 5 young people, him, Rebecca, Ryan, John, and Alina, huddled together near a bonfire. They were laughing, passing around a bottle of whiskey. The timestamp in the corner read October 14, 2016. The night everything changed. Edward's stomach clenched as he watched his past unfold before him. He barely recognized himself, carefree, oblivious. Then the laughter stopped. The camera panned toward the trees, where a shadow loomed just beyond the firelight. Someone was watching them. A shiver ran down Edward's spine. He knew what came next. The screams. The chaos. The blood. The video cut out. Edward exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the mouse. He clicked on the next file. This time the footage was different. It wasn't from their camera. It was from someone else's perspective, filming from the darkness, watching them. A low voice whispered from the speakers, "I never forgot." Edward jerked back in his chair, his breath catching in his throat. Someone else had been there that night. Someone who had seen everything. His pulse pounded as he opened the document labeled Final Night. It contained only a few words. You thought it was buried. You thought you could forget. But I remember, Edward. You can't run from the past. One down. 4 to go. A cold dread settled deep in his bones. This wasn't just revenge. It was a reckoning. Edward needed to warn the others. He started with Ryan. His number was disconnected. John. Straight to voicemail. Alina? A robotic voice. This number is no longer in service. Panic clawed at his throat. He had to find them. Edward logged into an old social media account he hadn't touched in years. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he searched their names. Rebecca's profile had gone silent a year ago. Ryan's last post was 6 months old. John's page was locked down. Alina's was different. She had posted something an hour ago. A single photo. A black and white image of the forest from that night. The same bonfire. The same trees. And a caption that sent a chill down his spine. It's time to finish what we started. Edward didn't hesitate. He jumped from his chair, shoving the USB drive into his pocket and rushing into the street. He flagged down a cab, rattling off an address he hadn't spoken aloud in years. The forest. The place where it all began. The drive was long, the roads twisting like the memories in his mind. He kept checking his phone, half expecting another message, another warning. But there was nothing. As they neared the old campsite, the cab driver gave him a wary look. You sure about this, mate? Edward forced a tight smile. Yeah. But he wasn't sure. Not at all. The forest was just as he remembered it. Silent, looming, filled with unseen eyes. The remnants of their old fire pit were still there, buried under leaves and dirt. And then he saw her. Alina stood on the far side of the clearing, her back to him. She was staring at something in the trees. Alina. She didn't turn. Edward took a cautious step forward. We need to get out of here. Now. She finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. It's too late, Edward. A twig snapped behind him. Edward spun, his heart hammering in his chest. A figure stepped out from the shadows. A face he never thought he'd see again. Edward's vision blurred with shock. No, he whispered. You're supposed to be dead. The figure smiled. Surprise. Part 5. The Reckoning. Edward's breath caught in his throat. The figure standing before him was impossible. His mind rejected the sight, but his eyes refused to lie. It was Daniel. Daniel, the one who had disappeared that night. The one they had buried. The one they had killed. Alina stood frozen, her face pale under the dim glow of the moon. Edward's entire body felt paralyzed, his pulse a relentless hammer against his ribs. Daniel smiled, slow and deliberate. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said. Edward opened his mouth, but no words came. His thoughts spiraled back to that fateful night. The screams, the struggle, the accident. No, it hadn't been an accident. They had made a choice. They had covered it up. But Daniel was here. And he was very much alive. Edward forced himself to speak. How? Daniel chuckled, the sound sending a chill down Edward's spine. How? He echoed. You mean how did I survive while my so-called friends left me for dead? His voice was bitter, venomous. His eyes flicked to Alina, then back to Edward. You buried me in that forest, Daniel continued. You all did. And then you went on with your perfect little lives, pretending like nothing happened. Edward's stomach churned. He could still see the moment in his mind, their hands digging into the cold, wet soil, the way Rebecca had sobbed, the way John had said, we don't have a choice. And then, silence. Years of silence. But now Daniel was here and he wanted revenge. Edward's mind spun. Daniel, listen to me? No, Daniel's voice was sharp, cutting through the night air. You listen to me. He took a step forward, his face twisting with rage. Do you know what it's like to wake up buried alive? Do you have any idea what it feels like to claw your way out of the earth, gasping for air, choking on dirt, feeling your own friends try to erase you? Edward's breath hitched. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. I've spent years planning this. Watching you. Watching all of you live your lives while I stayed in the shadows. Do you know how many times I could have killed you? How many times I could have made you suffer? Edward swallowed hard. Then why didn't you? Daniel's grin was chilling. Because I wanted you to feel it first. The forest was silent except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. Alina finally found her voice. Daniel, what do you want? Daniel turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. I want you to know what it feels like to have your world ripped apart. Edward took a cautious step forward. Rebecca. She's alive, Daniel interrupted. For now. A fresh wave of fear crashed over Edward. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. He tapped the screen and suddenly a video played. Rebecca tied to a chair, her mouth gagged, eyes wide with terror. Edward's stomach twisted. "You bastard." Daniel's eyes gleamed. "Oh, don't worry. She's safe for now. But the rest of you? I can't promise the same." The sound of a branch snapping in the distance made all three of them freeze. Edward's instincts screamed at him. They weren't alone. Daniel smirked. "Oh, I forgot to mention, I'm not working alone." Figures emerged from the darkness. 2, then 3, then 4. Faces concealed by masks. Edward's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just revenge. This was a hunt. Alina took a step back. "Daniel, please?" "You don't get to beg," Daniel spat. "You took my life from me. Now I'm taking yours." A figure lunged. Edward barely had time to react. A sharp pain exploded in his side as something hard struck him, knocking him to the ground. Alina screamed. Chaos erupted. Edward rolled to his feet, adrenaline surging through his veins. He swung wildly, catching one of the masked figures across the jaw. A grunt, a stumble, but they kept coming. Alina was fighting too, but they were outnumbered. Daniel stood back watching. Enjoying it. Edward's mind screamed for a way out, a way to stop this, but there was only one truth. Daniel wasn't going to stop. Not until they were dead. And then, a deafening sound. A gunshot. Everything stopped. One of the masked figures collapsed, blood pooling beneath them. Another shot rang out. Then another. Sirens. Flashing lights. Daniel's face twisted in rage as police flooded the clearing. Edward barely had time to process before strong hands grabbed him, pulling him away from the fight. Daniel was shouting, struggling against the officers. "This isn't over, Edward. Do you hear me? It's not over." Edward's vision blurred as exhaustion hit him like a tidal wave. Alina was beside him, shaking, her eyes filled with unshed tears. It was over. Or so they thought. Because as Daniel was dragged away, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. As if he knew something they didn't. As if this was only the beginning. A lesson to learn. Secrets, lies, and betrayal always come back to haunt us. No matter how deeply we try to bury our past, the truth finds a way to rise to the surface. The choices we make define us, and every action has a consequence. Trust, loyalty, and honesty are the foundations of a life without regret. If you enjoyed this thrilling story and want to hear more suspenseful tales, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more gripping content. What would you have done in Edward's place? Let us know in the comments below.